You would think Washington State, with its large military base near Tacoma, would have figured a way to include people who got vaccinated through the federal system in its lottery drawing. And you'd be wrong. Tuesday, at least 90,000 people, military members and their families vaccinated at Joint Base Lewis McChord, were left out of the state drawing. That's because the federal government does not have a system to share their names with the state. Governor Jay Inslee last Friday said they are trying to fix the problem.
We are working with the federal government to figure out if there is a way to solve that problem so that people who have received a vaccine through the federal channels, Department of Defense, veterans, could opt in.
So far, not so good. The drawing took place Tuesday without all those names. Also left out, 9,000 people in Washington who got their shots through the Portland VA, left out for the same reason. This week, Governor Inslee said most people are included.
Huge majorities of people, if you got your vaccine in the state of Washington, your name is in the database.
The Washington database holds about 3.5 million names that were part of the drawing. But the governor's assurances are little consolation for the tens of thousands left out during the first drawing. He also said the state is working on a way to allow people to add their names if they were vaccinated through the federal government, but nothing is in place. In Oregon, there is no large base like Lewis McChord, but 44,000 veterans and their families did get their COVID shots through the VA. Dave Baden, the Oregon Health Authority's leader in charge of the COVID vaccination, said last week that the state is creating a place where people can add their names manually to be included in the COVID lottery. But that system also is not in place right now. A spokesman for the governor's office told me details on the Oregon solution should be released later this week. I'm Pat Dooris reporting.